So you might ask the question, what do two wildland firefighters and an IT consultant have in common? Well, you're going to find out. So I'd like to introduce to you Persephone Whelan, and she is the Deputy Assistant Director of Fire and Aviation Operations with the U.S. Forest Service. And Joe Harris is Innovation and Organizational Learning, also with the U.S. Forest Service. They both have been wildland firefighters. Ty Wood is part of the Resilience Engineering Association. Hint, hint, if anyone's interested, see me. But Ty has a really interesting background as well. He was formerly an emergency medical technician, and he took what he learned and practiced as an EMT, including drills, into the internet-facing world. And so he's now an IT consultant. And what I think you may discover is that both of these communities are some of the best that I've ever seen in learning from incidents. And what I'm going to call that they practice is extreme learning. So with that, take it away. And thank you for being here.
Thank you, Beth. All right, let's see if I can. So I've got notes because I have a tendency to really get going talking. And if you can't tell I'm already working, I promise, camera guy, I will try not to leave the stage. But so yes, we're going to be talking about learning from unexpected outcomes. And we have quite a bit of information to share with you, so we thought the best way to kick it off is with a story. So have you ever been faced with a situation and you come up with an idea, you've got a problem, and you've got a possible solution. You come up with a plan, you propose it, and it's denied. So you think about it a little bit more. Maybe I need to revise my plan. You work that up a little bit more, and you propose it again, and it's denied. You're not allowed to implement it. So a lot of frustration, some anger, some issues coming up with this. So up in the top right-hand corner, that's me. I'm not wearing my hard hat at the moment because I'm pretty sure I've chucked it off into the sagebrush. Because I'm kind of having a bad day. And the reason why I'm having a bad day is you see that smoke column that's laying across that slope of the mountain? It's not supposed to be there. It's nowhere where it's supposed to be. So if you haven't figured out, as Beth said, my name is Persephone. I started working for the Forest Service in 1994. And despite finishing college, go Vandals, I decided to make wildland fire management my career and profession, and I haven't looked back since. So how this day started was it's what we call a prescribed fire. So this is fire intentionally lit in a very specific area with specific weather parameters. Lots of planning goes behind this, like months, sometimes even years to go into this. And so when a fire like this doesn't stay within the box that it's supposed to stay, it makes for a bad day. And it makes for a bad day in multiple ways because then what happens within our agency is what we call a conversion to a wildfire. So back in this time, when you converted something to a wildfire that was a prescribed fire, it was almost kind of like an albatross for the firefighters involved in that. Oh, you were on that fire. Way to go, you guys screwed that one up. And it also has a lot of social, political, and economic impacts when this happens. So what turned into what was supposed to be a couple of days with my crew there putting fire on the ground, and then we were going to leave with these other firefighters, turned into a 2-week standard wildland firefighting assignment. And as I was leaving this, I was looking at this fire column. It got a lot bigger than that. I remember looking in the mirrors of our engine as we were driving away, and I had a lot of emotions. I was mad. I was frustrated. I didn't understand how what happened. So there was a lot going on there. So as usual, when things like this happened, well, it was 2008. This is called the Elkhorn 2 fire. You can Google it if you want. But when I got back, I was notified that there was going to be an investigation. And I figured that was going to happen. And my brain started spinning out any number of scenarios that was going to happen as a result of this investigation. I was probably going to get disciplined. Oh, because did I tell you? My position on this fire, I'm what's labeled as the holding boss. So it's my responsibility to keep it in the box. That did a really good job, didn't I? So I'm thinking through my head, well, disciplinary action's definitely going to come. I might even lose my job, this job that I passionately embraced for many, many years. And so I got to thinking about it, and as the weeks leading up to the incoming investigation, I decided, you know what? I'm not going down without a fight. I'm going to share my perspective, and I'm willing to take my licks, but I'm going to make sure everybody knows how I feel about this situation. So the day came, and there was an investigation team, and let's just say when we all came into the room, they brought all the different leadership positions from this fire into the room. And when we got into the room, there was a really fascinating myriad of body language going on there. None of it was as open and friendly as what's going on in this room. There was a lot of lack of eye contact, a lot of posturing. It was very stiff, and it was really uncomfortable. But what the investigation team did is they set us down into a half circle of these chairs, and they said, all right, what we're going to do is we're going to start at what we call the 50,000-foot view. We're going to start really big picture, and we're going to dial down into the events of this day. And as we do that, everyone's going to get to share their perspectives and their thoughts of the events that happened that day. So as things progressed into the day, something really fascinating started to happen. We weren't interrogated. We were listened to. And as we began to share the different lenses through which every person on that fire was sharing what they were seeing, thinking, processing, what they were saying on the radio, what they really meant to say, things began to happen, and we started making eye contact with each other. We started talking. We started really digging into the events of what happened. And it was strange because I didn't agree with some of the things that some of my fellow firefighters did on this event, but I began to understand why they said what they did and what they were going on about from their perspective. It felt really weird, but I kind of embraced it, and I thought, this is interesting stuff. So at the end of the day, what started out in the beginning of nobody looking at each other and nobody certainly talking to each other, a bunch of us were standing out on the back porch, and we kind of looked around and we're like, what just happened? Because now I have in my pocket, I have a number of lessons that I have learned, things that I implement. I certainly implemented in the rest of my fire career. And we have some common understanding of each other. Not agreement, understanding of each other's actions. We thought, well, that wasn't normal. That's not what I've heard about investigations. And so we left. And then 2 days later, I could not stop thinking about this. And so I called up one of the investigators, and I said, hey, I don't know what you guys did, but count me in. I want other people, when they go to work and they're doing what they think that they're supposed to be doing, how they're supposed to be doing it, and unexpected outcomes happen, I want them to feel the way that I did, that they have a voice, that they have an ability to share what happened, an ability to learn from it without feeling like they're going to lose their jobs or be torn apart. And he said, sure, we'll bring you in. And I'll pass it over to Joe.
So Persephone told you a story about what she went through in an accident review, right? And there was a fair amount of animosity, maybe even bordering on hatred for some of your coworkers, right? So you go through this terrible event, and now there's all this bad blood, and you got to figure out, how am I going to work together with these people again in the future? And in fact, I can't actually see myself working together with these people again in the future. And we saw that play out over and over and over again in the Forest Service with respect to accident review. So I'm going to take you back to how the organization as a whole changed our trajectory of the way we looked at accidents so that people would come out of these events having learned, feeling better about the situation, and emerging stronger as an organization than they were when they went in. Because we had too many instances where people would come out of the backside of an accident and they'd be weaker. We'd be worse off. We didn't learn anything, and in fact, we were in a worse position as a result of the accidents that we experienced. So I'm going to take you back to 2001, the 30-mile fire. We had a fatality fire in Washington State, and there was 4 people died on this fire. There was a guy by the name of Elreese Daniels that was the crew boss, And this fire heated up on him, right? So it was called a type 4 fire, meaning it's a smaller fire. And then it heated up, it started getting bigger, and it transitioned to a type 3 fire. And so they asked him to be the IC, the incident commander. So he's now the crew boss and the incident commander. And this really emerging complex fire starts going, and it just starts taking off. It starts ripping out of there, right? So, and he goes about his day doing the best he can to lead that effort, and ended up with 4 fatalities. And in the first time in the Wildland fire community's history, he was brought up on criminal charges as a result of the things he did at work, the decisions he made to put this fire out. Somebody died, and then he got held personally liable and was brought up on criminal charges, looking at manslaughter charges. Fast forward to 2003, the Kramer fire. This one's in Idaho. We have 2 more fatalities on this fire in Idaho. And again, we have a type 4 fire that's emerging, right? It's blowing up, it's getting bigger, and we transition to a type 3 fire. And the duty officer that day is asked to take over and be the incident commander and be that type 3 IC. And then we had a bad outcome. Bad things happen. And again, second fire in a row, he's brought up on criminal charges, the incident commander. Then fast forward to 2006, we have the Esperanza fire. We have 5 fatalities on that fire, and the accident review team shows up, and people said, screw you, get the heck out of here. I don't want to talk to you. Give me my lawyer. I'm not talking to you unless you compel me in a court of law. I want my lawyer present, and I'm not going to answer any questions that my lawyer doesn't tell me I have to answer, and I'm only going to answer them as fully as my lawyer says I have to. That was an aha moment for our organization. We're like, how in the world are we going to figure out how to prevent these events from happening if we can't even figure out what happened, if people won't even talk to us? They won't tell us their stories. They won't share with us the lessons they learned that we can then help other people learn vicariously, so that we don't have to learn by trial and error, but we can learn by other people's actions, right? And so we were kind of stuck. I personally interviewed some of the folks on the Kramer fire a full decade and a half after the Kramer fire, and they told me about the implosion that happened on their district, where they knew what happened on 30 Mile, they knew criminal litigation was on the table, and so when they came in to get interviewed, it was a fairly cohesive unit, just a normal unit at the beginning before the accident happened. But after the accident happened, they all turned on each other, and they started pointing fingers, and they started saying, I never thought that person was qualified for their job. And they were saying things to protect themselves and throwing other people under the bus. And a decade and a half later, I'm talking to people, and they're saying, our unit still has not recovered. We still have adverse outcome. We still have bad blood as a result of that accident review, right? So we did not emerge stronger. We didn't learn. We didn't become better. In fact, we became worse, and it turned into an exercise in power dynamics, right? The most powerful people aligned, and one person got scapegoated, and this is a super complex event, but we need to figure out whose head's going to roll. Who are we going to say is whose fault it is? Who's in charge, on the ground, and making the calls, and that person is the person that's going to get the criminal liability, right? So why in the world would you want to be an incident commander? People started turning down assignments, and it was a nasty situation all the way around. And so we had to do some introspection, and we had to ask ourselves, what does a successful accident review look like? How do you define success? What questions do you want answered at the end of the review process? And so we turned to research, and we started looking to see what was out there in the research community to figure out, because we knew what we were doing right now wasn't working. We got to do something different. What does research have to offer? And they pointed us to this idea of the power of perspective, right? So this picture, if you look at it from the top, from the shadow, you would conclude that you're probably looking at a circle, right? If you're looking at it from the left-hand side of the screen, you might look at the shadow and conclude you're looking at a square. Or the right-hand side of the screen, you're looking at the shadow and you conclude that you're looking at a triangle. And it's not until you put all these different perspectives together and you say, well, obviously this is a circle, and you hear somebody else say, no, that's a square. Wait a minute, what, right? I was acting as if this was a circle. And they say, no, I was acting as if this is a square, right? And what we used to think it was our job as an accident review team was to pick the winner. Which one was right? Was it the circle? Was it the square? Was it the triangle? Who was right? But what we found through research is the most learning you're going to get is by figuring out where those conflicts in perspective occur, right? You heard Persephone say, I was mad, I was angry, but when I heard other people tell their story, I didn't agree with them, but at least I understood where they were coming from. Oh, if I thought it was a circle, I would have done the same thing, but it wasn't a circle. But we didn't figure that out till after, right? How can you learn in the moment and figure out how to communicate in the moment so that people understand what you're seeing is different maybe than what they're seeing? And so what we figured out also through research is that you have to make a choice at the beginning before you interview anybody. Do you want to learn from this event or do you want to punish people, right? And we're talking about accidents here, right? So we're separating out accidents from sabotage. If somebody intended for a bad outcome to happen, that's when punishment applies, right? But if somebody came to work to do their job and something bad happens, that's an accident. We work in a complex system, and we'll talk a little bit more about complex systems here in a minute. But if that's the case, then we need to prioritize learning and take punishment off the table. Otherwise, we're going to end up in this spot where nobody's going to talk to us and they all lawyer up. How did that turn out? Well, I understand, I fully agree, correlation does not prove causation. But in 2001, when the 30-mile fire happened, we were looking at 7 or 8 fatalities a year. And then we started playing around with different accident review processes. We tried to figure out how to learn better. We took a whole different take on safety. And by 2022, we were down to 2 to 3 accidents a year, so fatalities a year. So we know that what we did didn't make the situation worse. And we have pretty good evidence that perhaps, that's a pretty crazy coincidence that the timeline lines out perfectly like that. And we had been flatlined for a long time before that. Decades before that, we were hovering right around in that 8 fatalities a year. And all of a sudden with this change, we're starting to see a difference. So that's kind of the Forest Service's story of how we got to, we need to do things differently. And I'll turn the time over to Ty to talk about his story and how he got to where he's at.
So I'm kind of the odd one out, or at least you might think so. We have how it started and how it was going. So for me, I actually started a lot closer to these folks than where I ended up. I worked in an ER and on an ambulance here in Las Vegas, actually. I was trained in search and rescue. Didn't get to wear a helmet quite as often as Persephone, but definitely was familiar for me. I eventually moved into tech, and I was really surprised. We weren't perfect at what we did in the ER. If you've ever been to one, you've probably seen it yourself. But there were a lot of things that I thought we did really well, things that felt basic. The way we communicated, the way we talked about emergencies, the way we thought about them, the way we worked together, the way we did handoffs. There were so many things that were sort of essential to the work that I thought, well, now that I'm in tech working with tech folks, you always hear about how all these, tech companies, they've got cafeterias and foosball tables. Surely they also know how to handle emergencies. It turns out that's not really true. Or at least they thought, but they were doing it in their own way, very much related to sort of the notion of this work being in a computer. We heard Nick this morning talk a lot about kind of black and white. These people are by the numbers. Talk about a group of people by the numbers when the only numbers are 0 and 1 and on and off. That is sort of the world where it started. We ended up on a sort of similar trajectory. And when I say we, I want to clarify that tech as a whole, of course, is not a monolith. There are organizations that you can maybe think of or name or a part of that maybe didn't go through this trajectory or went a different way or maybe hasn't gotten there yet. But I think that's okay because really, even when we talk about one organization, they're not a monolith either. So I'm going to take this larger view and sort of tell you about how we got through it, and just keep in mind that you might run across someone who hasn't been through it yet or who's in a different spot in their journey. But that's probably true of your organization, might be different in your department, your pillar, your team, what have you. So really we have 3 main sort of stages in the way we think about it. It's just how it started. We'd sort of the beginning or this old way. As you see in the photo, everything sort of connects to this center circle. Everything is very traceable back to that. You see everything leading to that middle. This was a very common view. It was a lot like, debugging some code. What changed recently? What's the closest that seems to be what happened? Oh, you made a change and then this broke? Well, that must be related. So it must be your change that broke it. Everything was kind of focused on that center. Whatever, was the most recent thing is probably the most correct. And that kind of sounds useful in a way on the surface, until you realize that these systems are, much more complex. They're very large. Whatever triggered that incident may actually have had nothing to do with the change. You may just have bad luck to have pushed the button during that time. I actually heard of a team that accidentally started this tradition jokingly where they said they were afraid to make a change to the production site, and they happened to allow dogs in the office, so they got the dog's paw and made them press enter so that if it went bad, they could say, I didn't do it, the dog did it. So that they have dogs on their error page, it's a whole thing. But they eventually realized that this really wasn't working for them. If every time we say, okay, well, the code that went out is bad, it doesn't really leave you anywhere to go. Don't write bad code next time. Don't deploy it. There's nowhere to go with it. No one meant to write that bug. Had they realized that was a bug, they wouldn't have shipped it. So we kind of boxed them in, and we started to see that this really wasn't working, especially as the cloud became more popular. You were working with more and more other companies. You were working with larger and larger systems. This just was not working. And as we got better sort of handling these incidents, as these things grew, we also realized that a lot of the things that were sort of basic or easy, those weren't our incidents anymore because we were good at them. So the better we got, the more likely it was that the next incident was something that we had never seen before and perhaps didn't even think could possibly happen. So what really helped us move through is this here. It's a picture of the debriefing facilitation guide written by some folks at Etsy, primarily John Alspaugh, who also wrote a blog post about this. And it helped us understand that as the incidents became more complex, we couldn't just sort of look at causes. We had to look beyond just saying, oh, well, it was because of this code, or it was because this was down, or it was because of this one thing. It almost became a joke because you could go through some incident review process, and I used to joke that if you fall asleep in one and you wake up and someone calls on you what to say, you just say, well, we should have more alerting, we should have more monitoring. And you could say that for every single one of our incidents. And so the way out for us was, as an industry, was largely this sort of thing. Folks like John having gone to London, looking at research, just like Joe had talked about, looking at research, seeing how folks are doing things, just like Nick talked about, looking around and seeing how other folks are doing this, and what we can do too. Since we had all these things that we could always say for every incident, we all of a sudden realized we're not making progress. If every incident review, we say the same thing, and we do that thing, add more testing or monitoring, and then we still have the incident, and then we still say the same thing at the incident review, we realize we're going in circles. So primarily this guide helped us as an industry understand the idea of a blameless postmortem. That's like what Joe alluded to, is we realized that we could have essentially sanctions, or we could have learning and improvement. There was really no way for us to have both. I mean, from an internal perspective, we're not talking about, cybersecurity where we're breaching things like that. Of course, we want, bad actors out of the system. But in this case, where we're talking about folks who are working together, who showed up to do, the best job they could, they were instead facing blame. And of course, then it's easy just to go back onto the same fixes. So I want to highlight this quote here from the guide that really helped us. Especially, it says, the decision-making process of individuals proximate to the failure. That was the bit that we weren't getting. We were talking a lot about what the code said, maybe what the system did, how long it was down. With the logging we had, we could tell you sometimes to the 10th or 100th of a second when something happened. But for the most part, we were not looking at decision-making. That began to change with that, but one issue we had as we saw this is a lot of the industry sort of took that bit of blamelessness and sort of ran with it, but in the wrong direction. So you'd end up seeing reports like, at 10:06:08, engineer 1 did this thing. And I'm not just saying engineer 1 because I can't think of a name. Literally, you would end up with these reports that would say engineer 1 because their notion of blamelessness was, well, what's the best way to not blame anyone? Is to not even mention them, to not name them. Which, of course, the teams are not that large. It probably doesn't work anyways. And it also removed that ability to talk about decision-making. So we had started to pick up on some of this, but we were still missing some. Without the ability to say who that was, we couldn't ask that person about their decision-making. We couldn't look at what their experience was. We couldn't look at how long they'd been in that role. We couldn't look at any of that. So it really was a step forward and also a step back. But where we are today is what we like to think of as the learning from incidents sort of era. That's also the name of a community we have. These graphs here are courtesy of Alex Ellman, Indeed, and he does a great talk talking about his organization's journey. But this is really the contrast between where we were and where we are now, where if you only do that prevent and fix, kind of that circular area we were stuck in, you end up having some areas that are stable as you're kind of preventing things, but you kind of can't live in that world forever. You want to do more with less, make more money, resources are become increasingly constrained because things seem stable, so we can branch out. Well, that only trends so far. You have some sort of surprise event, and then you're back to doing this again. And instead, now where we are today is what Alex calls the learn and adapt, which is a reinforcing loop where we do have a surprise, we can't get away from that. These are complex systems, we're always going to have them. And instead of just doing those kind of rote actions to try and hope it prevents it, we're going to learn from it, and then we're going to lead in that adaptation, and that's going to elevate us each time. So even though we're going to have some points where we step back, we run into something surprising, on the long enough timeline, we're going to continue to sort of elevate where we're performing at. Again, I want to say not all organizations or even all teams at an organization are necessarily going to be here, but this is really where we start prioritizing learning as the main goal. That learning could be about how the system works. A good marker of a lot of our incident reviews is when people go, oh, I had no idea it even worked that way. I didn't even know System A and System B were connected. I didn't even know that was possible. And that's now the kind of priority and focus for us, is as many of those aha moments as we can get out of them, generally the better we've done. I'm going to turn it back over to Persephone here.
Okay, so while Ty and Joe and I were working, we thought, what are some takeaways that we would give you all? Because I always want something tangible to work with. So we said, what are some takeaways that we could give you guys if you want to explore having a learning culture, or maybe you already have a learning culture and you want to reinforce those concepts and work through that a little bit more. So we each picked one. And mine's going to be about ensuring you have a common vocabulary. So about a month or two ago, I was leading a team investigating an incident, an unintended outcome in Texas, and I was interviewing one of the leaders of the local organization, and he posed a question to me that continues to resonate for me, and it went something like this. How can he, as a leader, ensure good communication in a transitional workforce? So what he was saying to me was, in his organization, in the past, He had a workforce that was mostly people who'd been there for quite some time. 10, 15 years, 20 years was considered a tenured employee. And so if something wasn't going well or right in the system, he knew how to address that, how he could engage that employee, check some balances, and do some corrective things. But today, a tenured employee is 5 years in the organization. A lot of people are coming and going. And he was like, how do I make sure that information is moved through? Because he sees a difference in how information is relayed, gathered, and shared, and how people work in their work environment. It's totally new for him. So I thought about it for a while. And one thing I've been noodling on that I wanted to share with you guys is around this concept of words. Words have power. Words have meaning. And depending upon who you are, how you were raised, your social groups, how long you've been in an organization, you might have a different perspective about certain words that are used within your organization. And nowadays, I'm only saying nowadays because I'm rooted right now with this question and looking around, we have a tremendous diversity of perception within our workforces now, especially if you have this transitional piece of people coming and going and moving around. Words like accountability, investigation, safety, risk, communication, listening. These are all words that I'm using as your speaker, and I'm expecting that you as my audience have a shared meaning about those words. And rarely is this the case. Rarely do we share a common perspective of that. So I grabbed this quote from Brené Brown to really pound that one home for you. And she said, language is our portal to meaning-making, connection, healing, learning, and awareness. Having access to the right words can open up entire universes. When we don't have the language to talk about what we're experiencing, our ability to make sense of what's happening and share it with others is severely limited. Language shows us that naming an experience does not give the experience more power, but it gives us the power of understanding and meaning. So one thing I wanted to share with you is to take the time to ensure you have a common vocabulary in your workforce, especially around these important concepts that we've been talking about. How you can do that is up to you, whatever works best for your organization. Take a pulse check, do a survey. I don't know what all the fancy words are now. My favorite is humble inquiry. However you want to reach out to them, but take a check. Take the time to check with your workforce and ensure that you have that shared meaning and you're not making some pretty critical assumptions about words that are really important to you and your organization. One more quote for you, because I like words. Highfit says, if you are part of the organizational system, you must be part of the problem. That does not mean you are responsible for the whole mess, nor does it simply imply that you aren't trying to do any good to address the problem. It only suggests that there is an element of the problem, no matter how small, that stems from what you believe and how you behave and the loyalties that hold you. So when we have new people coming and going or moving around within our organizational cultures, we might not have the same context and background and experiences and the intent behind these words that we're all using this week. In order to become a learning culture, we need to take the time to revisit these concepts, slow down, take that time to address them with your people, and make sure that when you have a word that is important to your workforce, that you're using it and everyone has a shared meaning with it. Because words have power and words have meaning. Use them to your advantage and use them well.
So to tag on that, Persephone talked to you about the importance of words and making sure everybody has common definitions. And so I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into that and give a specific example of a few words that we're going to define. And so I told you we're going to talk a little bit more about complex systems. I want to talk to you about systems in general because that's a very important concept, very powerful concept. And if well understood by everybody, it enables conversations that you wouldn't be able to have otherwise, right? So Scott Page came up with the taxonomy of systems. He has simple, complicated, and complex systems. So the first one's simple. It's interactive and interconnected, right? So you can imagine you have an old school wristwatch, a wind-up wristwatch, and it's broken, right? You can take it apart, you can find the gear that's missing, you can replace that, and now the watch is working again, right? Root cause holds in this type of system. And so if you imagine that you're a mountaineer and you want to climb the highest peak in a given landscape, and you're going to climb Mount Fuji, then you know as long as you're going up, you're going to accomplish your goal, right? There might be easier routes to get there. One way might be easier than another, but as long as you're going up, you're making progress and you're going to get to where you want to go. Complicated systems add to interconnectivity and interactiveness diversity, right? So if we continue on with that mountaineering analogy, now you've got a mountain range. And you can't just simply go up because you might end up on a shorter peak, right? You want to get to the tallest peak. And so you've got to do a little bit more planning. Maybe you build a path, or maybe you create an algorithm, right? And as long as you follow that algorithm or you stay on that path, you're going to end up where you want to be, and that's repeatable, right? Russell Aikoff talks about systems a lot, and he made a pretty analogy he used a lot, got quite a bit of mileage out of. He said, imagine you take a car, you take all the cars that are available in the United States, and you want to make the one best car from all of those cars, right? So you ask which one has the best motor. Maybe Rolls-Royce has the best motor. Which one has the best fuel injection? Maybe Volkswagen. Which one has the best transmission? Maybe that's Mercedes-Benz, right? And so you get all these different parts in a warehouse, and you pick the best of each, and then you take the best part of each, and you try to put them together. Do you get the best automobile? Absolutely not. You don't even get an automobile, right? The reason why is because the parts don't fit. They've got to fit together in order for them to be a system. And so we put a little bit of emphasis on diversity, but we got to remember that as important as diversity is, we've got to have interactive and interconnected parts. We've got to have a system in the first place. If we just have a collection of parts or a heap or a pile, then you don't have a system. And so we got to pay attention, and once we get into the complicated side, we can't forget what we learned in the simple side. And then there's complex systems. And to interactivity and interconnectedness with diversity, now we add adaptivity, right? So if you're trying to climb the highest peak of the mountain range or that given landscape, and you're in the desert and you're on some sand dunes, right? You can plan that out. You can build an algorithm. You can draw a path on a map, and you can hand it to your employees at the office, and they can go out there and try to be successful. But if during the time that you design that map and the time your employees are out there on the ground, if there's a windstorm that came through, then everything's changed, right? Scott Page called this a dancing landscape. And if you don't empower your employees with the ability to calibrate on the fly, then you're not setting them up well for success. And so if you put them to work in a complex system and you give them complicated or simple tools to work with, and then blame them when there's a bad outcome, you can guarantee that you're going to have a scapegoat. That's a scapegoat situation waiting to happen. So we realized quickly that in the Wildland Fire Service, we're much closer to a complex system than the other systems. And so we realized that we've got to work on building better systems and support our employees better, rather than trying to figure out who's at fault or who's to blame or who's the root cause, who was the single person that made all this happen, right? We started talking about network causality. And the idea that there's no one thing that's going to cause this event to happen. It's a whole bunch of things that come together, and we've got to look at the entire network. So we're going to look at the network of influences, or the network causality is the way we put it. And then one more idea, I think that a lot of people are probably familiar with this, but this is something that was really powerful in the Forest Service, is when you look at a system, you think about a system and how things interact together, that in any system, that an organization is going to find itself working in, you're going to have 3 different boundaries that's going to create the envelope of operations, right? So you're going to have the boundary of financially acceptable behavior. These are the bean counters. You might have a really awesome safety innovation, but it's too expensive, and we can't afford it. On the bottom, you got the boundary of acceptable workload, and the mantra behind this is work smarter, not harder. And we reward people for being more efficient and figuring out more efficient ways to do work. And so as we get our experts where they don't have the money and they're trying to work smarter, they start inching towards this boundary of safety, right? And the people that get right on the edge without falling off, we call them experts. And we reward them and we give them all kinds of praise. But this boundary is invisible and it moves, right? So if it jigs when they think it's going to jag and they step off the edge, now they're the villain, right? They're the criminal. They deserve to go to jail. It doesn't make any sense to think about it in those terms. And so with that, I'll turn the time over to Ty to talk to you a little bit about stories.
So when Persephone asked me, what the takeaway I wanted to share with you folks is, I realized that I wanted to talk to you folks about stories. I have this quote here from David Woods and Richard Cook from the writings where they encouraged to pursue second stories, where second stories are beneath the surface, and that's where we discover multiple contributors. Especially in my current world of engineering, what they would have called first stories are really easy. We have them all over the place. Again, at 10:06:83, the 0 was a 1 instead of what we expected it to be, and then therefore it crashed. It's not technically wrong. You ever read like a movie synopsis on Netflix or something for like a movie you've seen, and you read it and you're like, you're not wrong, but you've also missed the entire point of the movie? A lot of our first stories are like that, where you can't pick one that you said, well, that didn't fit. There's nothing incorrect about it, but it really doesn't tell you about what actually happened. It doesn't give you sort of a toehold into the understanding that Persephone talked about. It doesn't give you a way to relate it to your own experiences. It's only through second stories that we're able to do this. Second stories show us challenges, constraints, adaptations, that helped everyone who was there get through what it was. Just that first story alone does not reveal any of these things. Really, without this second story somewhere in our process, in our review, in whatever we call it, it's kind of impossible to learn from an event. If every event you had at your company I reduced to an Excel spreadsheet with timestamps and said, make sure this doesn't happen again, you'd either make sure it happened again in different timing to make me technically correct, or you'd be stuck. So stories are very powerful. You might remember some graph like this in elementary school, depending on where you went to school. They call this, some version of this is usually Freiherr's pyramid. It talks about how our stories tend to follow these arcs. They tend to have these same points. They tend to sort of go in this pattern. And despite that, they still have this power to help us understand the way things worked from the perspective of the people, because the story sort of rises and falls in a way that we don't necessarily know what's going to happen next. And that's critical because the people, often us, who were in that event, in that incident, in that problem, we didn't know what was going to happen next. So when we step back and we try to learn from these things, it's really tempting to take that knowledge of well, I know what happened. I can see that the smoke wasn't in the spot it was supposed to be. And it's really easy and tempting to sort of just like draw this straight line story. But we need to tell our stories in these sort of rising and falling, remembering that we don't know or didn't know at the time what's going to happen next. It's also a hook to help people remember. At your organization, I doubt you have water cooler or break room conversations about, oh yeah, did you hear that Jane did this thing at 10:05:53? No, you say, wow, did you see that thing that happened? And I thought it was going to go awfully, and then Jane saved the day, and it was this whole thing. It's the stories that also help it propagate through your organization. Those lessons that you learn, if you just lock them up, put them in a filing cabinet, throw them on the company intranet, whatever it is, without that story to help it go through the organization, you're still arguably not actually learning from the event. And I'm going to turn it over to Joe to help us close out.
Right, so where we're at now, I took you through the trajectory of where we went in the Forest Service with respect to accident reviews. And we landed on this idea of story, and we realized stories make lessons sticky, right? If you can put it in a story, people can remember it. For time immemorial, we've been sitting around the campfire telling stories, and that's just what we're adapted to, right? But we started asking, what makes one story better than another? How do you know at the end that you've put together a good story that people can learn from that supports the values of your organization? And so we came up with these 3 principles. So Persephone went through what's called an FLA, a facilitated learning analysis, where she came in and she was, there's a lot of animosity and maybe borderline anger. And then we went through this event and everybody understood everybody else's perspective. And then they came out and had all these lessons learned. And we, like I said, we've had a lot of success since we've changed the way we've looked at looked at accident reviews. But now what's the next step, right? Where are we going in the future? And so we got together as a group and said, hey, what are the principles that this is all founded on? And what do we want to make sure are covered within the stories that we're telling? How do we make sure that the stories are important and will last over time and people will grab onto them? And we came up with these 3 principles. As just culture, we've got to treat people fairly. So when you read the story, you can read the story and understand where the other people were coming from. You don't turn them into villains. You don't make them one-dimensional characters. You don't you don't neglect to fill in the context behind their decisions so that the reader's like, well, why did they do that? If the reader's asking the question, you haven't made sense for them, right? You haven't put the context in there. They should be able to step into their shoes and say, I understand exactly why they did that, and I got to think about some things I'm going to do so I don't fall into that trap. So that all is wrapped up into just culture. Obviously, we want learning, right? Any kind of lessons learned that people say, hey, I went through this event, this is what I learned, and this is what I'm going to do differently next time. Let's wrap that into the story so that people in the FLA can read that and decide for themselves, hey, that's a good idea. I'm going to do that as well, right? So that makes it a little bit more sticky and useful. And then this idea of systems thinking, right? We're not one-dimensional entities that don't interact with other people. We always interact in complex systems when you're dealing with people. And so tying that system in and making sure that you're telling that complex story and you're filling in the holes so that everybody understands the complex system that these people are working in. If you can put all of those together and wrap it up into a story, now you've got a sticky story that can persist and help your organization get better and help vicarious learning so that you don't have to learn by trial and error, because our job's just too dangerous to learn by trial and error. We can't rely on that. We've got to figure out a way to enable vicarious learning to be successful. So in closing, I just want to put out a couple of more ideas that we found really useful as we dove into the research to figure out how to do accident reviews better. And we came across this work by Carl Weick on sense making, right? And this idea that we always live in flux. The world is way more complex than we can understand. And as we're in that flux, we're always scanning. We're always looking for something. And this is, the analogy here is like a flour sifter, right? You're pouring reality through a flour sifter, and every once in a while, something sticks in that sifter. And you look at it, and you study it, and you try to figure out what it is, and you name it. And once you name it, that becomes very powerful. Then other people can start talking about it, and you can, multiple minds can start working on what's the best way, is this really a thing, and what's the best way to use that, right? And then you start enacting it, and as you enact it, you put it back into the system of flux, and you just keep doing that over and over again, and that's called sense making. So you might have, like Amy Edmondson might come up and talk about psychological safety, right? She goes and studies these organizations and says, hey, there's this pattern that exists. I think this is a really useful pattern. She comes up with a name for it, and now we can all talk about it, and we can all learn vicariously through that, right? And as you do that over and over again and share those patterns or those ideas that you come up with, that's a way to take the next step from individual learning to organizational learning, right? You figure out how to make those patterns and employ those patterns within your organization. Another idea that we came across was by Ed Schein. You can't really talk about how to change a huge organization like the Forest Service without talking about culture and having an understanding of how culture works and how culture change works, right? And so if you can imagine, you've got a buoy up on the surface of the water and you've got a tugboat and you're pulling that buoy because you want to see different actions and decisions, right? So actions and decisions are at the surface level. That's what you can see. And so you got this tugboat, and you're trying to pull these actions and decisions. You're trying to influence your employees to work, to behave differently. And as soon as that tugboat lets go, then that buoy floats back right to where it was. And as soon as you let go, as soon as you stop making your efforts, you notice that there's no permanent change in place. And what you've got to do is figure out the deep assumptions and daylight those deep assumptions and see if they're valid. And when you find an assumption that's not valid, talk about it and try to figure out a different assumption to come up with. So that's kind of in summary. We want to ensure we have a common vocabulary with the people that we're trying to form a learning group with. We want to understand systems thinking, and we really want to drive home the power of story and what makes a story sticky and what makes it valuable for vicarious learning into the future. And with that,